The Spinoff Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/getadvice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on the Spinoff or wherever you get your podcasts. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Toby Manhire. This is a Gone by Lunchtime special edition on the local elections 2022. The original lineup of Gone by Lunchtime will be back very soon. In fact, live from Tauranga, where we are doing a special edition of the podcast. That's me and Annabelle Lee Mather and Ben Thomas and the newly elected Mayor of Rotorua, Tanya Tapsell, and the Minister of the Crown, Jan Tinetti. If you are listening to this before Sunday, I'm talking right now on Thursday the 13th, so that will be Sunday the 14th, 15th, 16th of October. Come along. More details on the Escape Festival website. You can look that up on the internet. But today, we have 2 very special guests. The core team that have been working at the Spinoff on our coverage of the local elections, made possible by the Public Interest Journalism Fund via New Zealand On Air. Shanti Mathias, hello. Kia ora. And Stewart Sowman-Lund, hello.
Good morning.
You also guested on the Real Pod the other day, really.
This is a big week for fans of my voice.
It is is it a coup? Is that what you would call it, a coup? Are you slowly inveigling your way into all the podcasts?
You just said that the original Gone by Lunchtime lineup are away, so I feel like we're sort of like the Queen plus Adam Lambert of the podcasting world. Okay. We've sort of snuck in, we've taken over from the original team, but we're still selling out stadiums.
If you just extended that metaphor by about 20 minutes and 7 or 8 layers, you'd be really Ben Thomas incarnate.
Well, I almost wore a band T-shirt for Ricky Martin or something, just to slip into that persona.
And thanks to Tiahi Butler, golden-voiced producer. Let's hear that golden voice.
It's a pleasure to be here, Toby.
Oh, and also to members. Your voices are all exceptional also. Shanti, Stewart, they're over. The local elections are, well, nearly over. Are they leaving a void, or are you both furiously refreshing the results to see what the results are in the last... What are the last 4? Can you remember? This is a test for you, Shanti.
Preliminary results? No, progress, preliminary.
Progress, preliminary. But which are the 4? We've had preliminary, so we're still waiting for final. What are the? Can you remember for $1 for each of the ones that are the mayoral races that we're still waiting on?
Far North?
Yes.
Southland?
Yes.
Gore?
Yes. One other. Stuart, do you know Stuart?
No, you've taken them off.
Mata Mata.
That's it. I knew that.
Mata Mata Piako. What we're going to do today is we're just going to do a kind of breakneck rip through the contests, the main contests. We've all been around the country a bit, and so we have different levels of expertise and memories that we can pluck from the recesses of our heads to describe what's happened and what the issues were there. And then we will talk a bit about what the tea leaves say in terms of implications for central government and also the turnout, which is going to finish about 40%. Based on the numbers that came out yesterday, it looks like Auckland is going to do slightly better than last time. And when I say slightly better, I mean slightly better than really terrible. So it's gone from 35.3 to 35.6 or something like that, depending on how many of those special votes are valid. But anyway, let's crack on. 583 elections across the country. Stewart, let's start at the bottom. Let's start at only the bottom geographically. That's for no other reason as the bottom. The Invercargill race. It was an interesting one. You spent some time there. You went to a debate. You talked to some of the contenders. It was a curious one because the incumbent, who has been mayor there for 7 or 8 centuries, Tim Shadbolt, basically he pretty much accepted that he wasn't in the race from the get-go, right?
Yeah, I went on a sort of search for Shadbolt in my 48 hours or so in Invercargill.
Yeah.
There was no sign of him, aside from portraits and pictures hanging in the council office. There was no hoardings. Any sort of... I talked to his deputy, who is now the mayor. We'll get to that. And he was like, well, you won't get to speak to him. He's basically vanished. And when I did get to speak to him over Zoom a few days later... He said he'd done his dash, he was a lost cause, and he'd pretty much, like you say, accepted defeat. And yet, when the results came out this week, he said he was shattered.
He was shattered because he didn't even get back onto council?
Yeah,
right.
He was pretty convinced he was going to do that. I think he came in overall 5th in the mayoral race with just under 1,000 votes.
So it looked, even then when you were there, as though the two likeliest would be Nobby Clark, who's the deputy.
Yeah.
I think he's like 70 years old or something.
Yeah.
He's been around. He's a old school, cranky, as in sort of just want to get stuff done and, not interested in looking for 20 years in advance, blah, blah, blah. And Marcus Lush, who we know as the late night host on News Talk ZB, former star of BFM, and he's a councillor. He got elected in a by-election. It was impossible to say, really. It looked like those two. And then what happened?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I thought it would be between those two, and that was sort of the angle that I went into that race with and talked to both Nobby and Marcus about that. And based on the first set of results that we got, that was exactly how it came to be. Nobby in first, Marcus in second. But
can we say Lushy? Can we say Nobby and Lushy? I'd prefer.
Yeah, we can do
just
that.
As style point.
But then, based on the second round, the preliminary votes that we've had so far this week, Lushy fell into third, and the former deputy mayor of Invercargill moved into second, Tony Biddle, who resigned.
Okay.
Sort of in the midst of all of that very public chaos within the council, the Thompson report and that sort of thing. And that sort of interestingly, when I talked to Nobby, I said, well, I feel like it's going to be between you and Marcus Lush. And he said, I don't think so. Yeah. I think that Lushy's got the Auckland support on self-selecting stuff polls and the like. But down here, it's going to be between him and Tony Biddle, and he ended up being correct. And he said that was based on polling. What he really meant was that there were some certain self-selecting polls that were not from nationwide news sources, but they were still very much, unscientific polls.
Like people putting beans into particular jars at market gardens, that sort of thing.
I mean, that's what you'd expect, but there was a particular outlet, which actually you can read all about on the Spinoff today, called What's on Invis, which is a Facebook page and website there, and they ran a lot of polling and they have some ties to the Clark campaign. So he was relying on that, and it ended up being fairly accurate.
So where can I read that? On thespinoff.co.nz,
I think the site is thespinoff.co.nz.
Shanti, you spent some time in the resort town of Queenstown it was probably 3 weeks ago or so. You went down there, and what did you find? Was it, I think your assessment early on was that there were kind of 4 candidates that were in the running?
Yeah, so I went to 3 Queenstown mayoral debates in 2 days, which is probably more than most people should have been to. But interesting. That was enough to kind of see which lines they kept pulling out. There were 4. There was Nita Shetty, who was also running for council, a sort of community-minded business person. There was Glenn Lewis, a sitting councillor. First term, he was elected in 2019. He got him and the other lowest polling candidate got the exact same number of votes, so he got into council based on a coin toss. There was Olivia Wensley, who runs Startup Queenstown Lakes, was involved in the Me Too movement, quite a high-profile lawyer. Her father-in-law is a property developer. She had a line with the Lakeview development in Queenstown, which has been a complete disaster of sort of leaky building. She had a line that she used at all 3 debates I went, which is, you can't help who you love, even if that person is the son of a property developer, which I thought was rather good. And then there was John Mitchell, who ran as a Labour candidate in Southland in 2020 and is sort of a disaster management expert. So those were the four.
There was a vacancy because Jim Bolt had stood down.
Yeah, so quite well known, got Queenstown on the map, sort of mayor Jim Bolt was stepping down. Glenn Lewis is the mayoral-elect now, so he was sort of quite seen as the kind of incumbent, the council candidate. He kept emphasising his experience on council, that he kind of knew how it worked. None of the other main candidates had ever been elected members at all, so that was a kind of
so he
one
was
element.
Probably the favourite. Did he seem like the favourite when you watched the debates? Or
well, there was an interesting moment at the Crux debate. Crux is an independent news site in Queenstown, where each candidate was asked who they would vote for if not for themselves. All three, except Nita Shetty, said they would vote for Nita Shetty. She said that she would vote for Glenn Lewis. He was also the only candidate who explicitly mentioned climate change before being asked a question about it, which I just thought was a interesting element. All the rest of them sort of said, climate change, we have to do something about it. But he said, this is our urgent action for our region. It's really important for the tourist aspect. And he's committed to reinstating one of Jim Bolt's policies, which is a visitor levy for everyone who visits Queenstown. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with reopening borders and all of that.
You wrote some interesting pieces in which you kind of pinpointed the issues around tourism, obviously, which is what we associate with Queenstown, and it's both its kind of greatest strength and potential, but also its greatest hazard in a way, right?
The pressure it places on infrastructure like roads, the number of tourist cars driving up and down, as well as all the short-term workers who they need over the winter season for the ski fields. That's huge amounts of housing pressure. There's a lot of, I also wrote a story about Airbnb and interviewed someone from Queenstown about, the pressure that Airbnb was a really hot topic of how much pressure people renting out their houses on Airbnb rather than providing long-term rentals to permanent residents. There's a lot of tension there, but of course only the permanent residents get to vote, so it's almost it seems like they kind of don't want more tourists, and kind of that all that sort of some of the bigger picture stuff about getting in that the government says we want high value tourists. That's Queenstown is kind of at the core of that, I think.
I spent some time in Dunedin. I interviewed a candidate for the Otago Regional Council, Slime, who came, I think, last.
Yeah, and when I was down in Dunedin a few days later, and I was amazed at how many posters for Slime I could just see on.
I haven't done the
corners.
detailed analysis, but I suspect Slime did rather better in Dunedin than in the other parts.
Slime was running in the Dunedin constituency, right?
So. Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's of course. So you would expect that. Great point. Thank you, Shanti. Although Slime did get more than 2,000 votes, so it wasn't like a wipeout.
That's more than Tim Shadbolt got.
Well, there you go. There you go. Slime was, for those who haven't been keeping up on Slime News, was a kind of stunt candidate and who caricatured the idea of embracing synthetic nitrate and pollution and all of that. Anyway, in the main race for the mayoralty, Aaron Hawkins, the Green mayor, was unseated by someone called Jules Radich, and there were sort of four serious people in the running there too. There was Hawkins, Radich, someone called Sophie Barker, who also was a councillor like Radich, kind of sort of centre left, and Lee Vandervis, who was a sort of famous, outspoken, angry man, and he had become a bit, among many other things, had taken the council to court over what emanated from a parking fine, and that got rejected by the Supreme Court in the weeks before the election. But because it's STV, it kind of, I saw a few reports. RNZ described it as a landslide to Radich, and that's true in some sense. But it's one of these kind of peculiarities of STV, because in fact in the last iteration, as they call it, which is the number of counts you do on STV, where Radich got across the 50% line, it was very close in many ways, insofar as if all of Sophie Barker's votes had gone to Aaron Hawkins, which they wouldn't have, but I think it's safe to assume most of them would have, then it would have been there was only like 100 or so in it. So still, Radich won. Some were surprised by that. It looked like a lot of it was to do with Hawkins talked about it being difficult for progressive mayors around the country as a result of Three Waters and the general kind of sense of a central government issuing edicts. And that was part of it. The other part of it, which was important, is a lot of people were talking about George Street and the refurbishments to George Street, the main drag in Dunedin. And this is a thing that is true around the country. We'll perhaps come back to that a bit later, that local issues very obviously loom large in local elections.
I was just going to say, because, I mean, we're going to get into the sort of broader issues of what the government's impact on these local election races had. But for me, I was slightly surprised to see Hawkins lose by the margin that he did. Is that when you were down there, what was your feeling of that?
The people I spoke to who live in Dunedin and understand Dunedin said that they thought Radich was going to run Hawkins close. Hawkins was surprised, I think, and if I thought it was going to be very close between the two of them. And the nature of the STV system is such, of course, that look, Radich won on first count too, so the system didn't matter from that point of view. But I thought it was always going to be close, and I would argue it was kind of close in terms of the sentiment, the direction that people were going. Obviously, there was. Hawkins was not sufficiently loved by Dunedin voters to win a second term. So, travelling north up the coast, Shanti, to Christchurch, where we had Mr. Meats versus Mr. Major, which was quite difficult to tell the two of them apart in a photo of them standing together. Mr. Meats versus Mr. Major sounds like a rejected Roald Dahl novel to me a bit, and they do have. It was an interesting race. No, that's not true. It wasn't an interesting race, really, was it? Or was it? I mean, listen to me talking from Auckland. Tell me what was interesting. What was at play in Christchurch?
Yeah, I famously have sort of face blindness for white men, and I was really struggling. But it was really just really obvious to me how much what they were saying was very similar. Sort of, Phil Major, a few days sort of before when the election was really heating up, was a sitting councillor, first-time sitting councillor, runs a construction company who had voted against the government's national policy statement on urban development. And said Christchurch, he was one of, and he was saying, no, we don't want any more densification in Christchurch. Meats was really saying the same thing. There really wasn't, maybe there was a bit of, Major had a thing of like, it's so hard with, when you're sitting in a car and you're watching the bus lane, the buses go past and there's not enough people on the bus, and that's really frustrating to me. So, probably a little bit, Meats was the slightly more left-leaning, Major was the more right-leaning one. And, but yes, very, very similar, both committed to the Christchurch Stadium, which is that kind of expensive millstone around the City Council's neck.
And now they're, quite amusingly, which is always going to happen, now what we're going to do is we're going to get the other councils to chip in. The other councils are like, okay, good luck with that. Anyway, that's side note, sorry.
But early polling showed Major ahead by quite a significant margin. In the end, he only won by less than 3,000 votes. I think it was 49,000 to 52,000, something like that. So it's actually pretty
closer than the polls
margin.
had suggested.
Do you think the Jordan Major factor had any impact?
Here we go. We're going back to the Real Pod now. Did you discuss this on the Real Pod?
Very briefly, but a local elections crossover.
I didn't know this until Alex Casey revealed it to me that Phil Major is the father of Jordan Major
from The Bachelor.
The man who famously said, and we had a complaint about language in the inbox recently by a gentleman who said he would not be listening again. So I'm not worried about him. But if you're concerned about bad language, then please block your ears for a moment. Jordan Major famously said in some international Bachelor thing, is that right, Stewart? We're not here to fuck spiders, which regrettably was not the slogan of his father, Phil Major, although I think he also is not interested in any.
Yeah, did that come up in any of the debates?
It didn't. No? Nobody mentioned it, so maybe there just needs to be more publicising of this. Major's big dream is having the Commonwealth Games in Christchurch again. It's like, we've got a new stadium, we've got all these other things. Let's just have the Commonwealth Games. There's a really good piece of analysis by Tina Law and Stuff from a few days ago, which is about how feasible and how cheap it would actually be to host the Commonwealth Games, even if you do have all this new infrastructure. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. There's a few other, 6 of the People's Choice left-leaning councillors. There's one that's kind of up in the air, got onto council, and it will be kind of interesting to see how that plays out. 8 of the 14 candidates there's 17 councillors plus a mayor on Christchurch City Council. 8 of the ones that May just said that he was supporting have also made it on. So I think he'll feel pretty confident that he's got a big team.
What about Environment Canterbury? How did that end up roughly? Do you know?
Not so many of the People's Choice candidates made it on to Environment Canterbury. It'll be interesting to see with the 2 Ngai Tahu representatives as well, how that shifts the balance. There are 14 seats plus 2 Ngai Tahu members as of this training with full voting rights. The kind of disaster management, the kind of climate change stuff, I wrote an article about it on the spinoff.co.nz, which is, I think, just going to loom really big for regional councils across the country.
You and I both, Shanti, paid attention to Nelson, which had lots of interesting plots and subplots, one of which was a pretty dysfunctional, civil war-ridden 3 years. You looked at that, didn't you, quite a month or so ago? How would you describe the state of the Nelson Council over the last 3 years?
It just seems... Multiple councillors describe it to me as a really toxic workplace. Yeah. There's Tim Skinner, who's a councillor who got on again, has sort of been involved in multiple altercations with other councillors, as well as pushing a protester over and having to be kind of, told off by the council for that. The whole use of this code of conduct is a bit of a kind of structural thing for local governments, but you can see it really clearly there. A lot of hurt feelings, a lot of... there were 7 female women on council last election. Now there's only 2. It's just multiple women have said that it doesn't feel like a very safe workplace. So that kind of workplace issues, internal council issues, have been a big source of tension for councillors. So not sure how the new mayor is going to try to soothe the feelings. Well,
interesting in that in the lineup of candidates for the mayor there were 0 women, which some of those, when that was put to them in a really good debate that was hosted by the Nelson Weekly that I attended at a cocktail bar called, I think, Kim's. They acknowledged that might be partly because of the dysfunction and because of generally a mood, not just at Nelson, but generally of a kind of slightly poisonous in the air. You remember there was a Christchurch councillor who got attacked. That whole mood is one of the things that is interesting in terms of a lack of contestability generally, probably.
Can you draw any link between, so Nick Smith is now the mayor of Nelson.
Oh, I was holding that back. Absolute spoiler.
His sort of end of his parliamentary career was tinged with some issues relating to treatment of staffers. Now he's the mayor of a council that's previously had issues.
Yeah, and I interviewed him and put that to him, and he said he'd obviously was ready for that question, and he had a set out answer, which is there was an isolated incident in which he swore, and he regretted that, and he's learned from that. But his experience over 30 years meant that he was at Parliament, meant he was a better placed than anyone. And he also said, and I heard them say this again separately, Nelson's a small town. He's had staff across 3 decades in Parliament. If he was a bad boss, and then people would know. And I guess there's some truth in that. What his opponent said is, hang on a minute, mate, there are reports in terms of when there was that parliamentary service inquiry into what happened there. There were reports that came out in Stuff and Newsroom that it was a pattern of bullying and harassment. And so it's an open question whether or not he is the person who can create a unity on that council. He won the mayoralty comfortably, and it was looked that way. He was just sort of a different level in terms of the kind of professional quality of the campaign in some ways. I talked to him, and he had in front of him a Curia poll, which he provided me a couple of examples from, but obviously kept the big numbers close to his chest. But you could see that he was confident from that point, and that he had he was just polished. I mean, of course he is. He's been there for so long. And there were 3 others that were in the running, and Nelson was using STV for the first time, so that gave them if Nick Smith winning 40% on the first round didn't mean that he would necessarily win. if there was enough anti-Nick Smith vote. The others there was a young guy called Rohan O'Neill-Stevens who's had a bit of coverage. He was the youngest councillor at the last election, I think. He's now...
And he's Green endorsed.
He's Green endorsed. He's a Green member as well. Then there's Matt Laurie, who you've talked to as well, Shanti, and he didn't stand for council in the way that as Rohan did. So Rohan was the top vote in council. Matt Laurie decided to just go for the mayoralty, and I think he'll be a loss because he's a sort of an interesting nuanced guy. And then the other guy was Skinner that you mentioned, Tim Skinner, who is a slightly more abrasive type, and he has been re-elected to council.
He's been re-elected, but he had a little sort of Nelson Citizens Alliance, which was a sort of right-wing ticket. Most of the rest of him didn't get back on. Yeah,
curious group. And it's an interesting strategy, this. Jules Radich had a group too, and I think it's...
Nobby Clark had a group.
Well, it's not a stupid thing, is it? Just from a simple level, you can put any affiliation in there, right? Like we could put, Shanti's Mavericks as our group if we were standing together on. And what it means is that for each person who is not particularly voter, who's not particularly well informed, if they see, well, I know that I like Stewart, and so I'm going to just give ticks to the other people who are on that ticket. I'm surprised we don't see it more, to be honest. Like, why not? Perhaps the reason why not is in terms of that Citizens Alliance in Nelson. There was a fracas in the closing days where there was an advertisement published in the Nelson Weekly, which they subsequently apologised for and retracted digitally, which included these kind of some quite outrageous attacks on other candidates, like personal attacks.
Most of the candidates they attacked got in as well.
And but their complaint in part was that because it was in print, it was the last edition before the polls closed. Whether or not it made any difference, I don't know. But it did tell you, Skinner himself disavowed those statements. Though he's on the tick, he said, well, I've been endorsed by this group, but I certainly wouldn't. So it is potential. The risk attached to it, I suppose, is that if Shanti's Mavericks, if Stewart does something completely outrageous with spiders or whatever, and then that comes back to punish the rest of us.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Pōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirahama, the Ko Papa Ko Rangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spinoff Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spinoff. You can help us keep all of The Spinoff's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Let's keep going. Let's go to Wellington. Let's travel on the cruise on the Inter-Islander across to Wellington. This one sort of bucked the trend, didn't it? Who wants to talk to that? Talk to what happened in Wellington.
Well, all I can say, because I was not there, is that it was fascinating to see that Paul Eagle, who, by way of having maybe name recognition by being in Parliament, being in government, came in fourth.
Well, did he? Shanti, we were talking about him in the office. He came in. It's an interesting. This gets kind of nerdy and will probably expose the limits of my statistical expertise. But when you count STV, it's the nature of removing the lowest polling person one by one can sometimes distort the idea of what that ranking is.
But on the only poll that matters, he came in fourth.
Well, what I'm saying is that on the first count, he was second, wasn't he?
Yeah.
But he eventually came fourth.
Well, he massively underperformed. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it was a humiliation.
But also, during the campaign, it seemed like he was at times absent, at least from media interviews? Didn't you struggle to get
hold of him, and he was always affable, right? Like, and he was like, "Oh yeah, no, we'll do that," and then he just didn't return my call.
And he didn't go to all of the events. I mean,
no, I think he went to most of the events.
Tory Whānau was pretty impressive.
It seemed like he was running what they call a small target strategy. It was as if he had decided or been given polling information that suggested that he was the front runner. And so you don't do anything to mess that up. Why take a risk? Either that or there was complacency. I don't know. Tory Whānau, on the other hand, ran an on-the-ground campaign for a year, and she was. It worked to her advantage, for example, that Andy Foster's line early on, and I don't think he was necessarily being disingenuous, was just say, I'm not really sure who she is. Is she a serious? No, I don't think so.
I talked to Andy Foster when he made his fairly late bid to go for a second term. Wasn't that long before, before you could, the cut-off for putting your name in the ring. And he said he sort of envisaged it as a two-horse race, and he did for the rest of his campaign between him and Paul Eagle, was pretty dismissive of other candidates in the race. And I feel like, to some extent, the media for quite a while were also fairly dismissive of other candidates in that race. It felt like for quite a while people were putting those two together.
It's an interesting question insofar as how much is this, it's been said ad infinitum that this is bucking the trend across the country. And to some extent that's a reflection of the Wellington population. But also it is, I think, that campaign was hard-working. You saw the Green Caucus get in behind. Aura's Gutterman was there, Chloe Swarbrick was there, Methilia Ture was involved. Marama Davidson, James Shaw was very vocal, and it was the only one that truly had, in any of the elections around the country, that had any parliamentary party machine behind them.
Could you kind of compare it to Chloe's Auckland Central victory?
I think you could,
in the sense that it was a very on-the-ground campaign.
I think you just did,
and the polling.
There we go.
And the polling was not necessarily the result that we ended up with. Same with Chloe's.
The poll
campaign.
wasn't a mile off, was it? And one of the things about the polls, again, is that because we're talking about such low turnouts, almost always under 50%, and that it's the polls are not necessarily wrong. They might be dead right if we had compulsory voting. It's as much which ones of those, as it always is, and we work our way up to Auckland, which can bring out their vote. And I think the Tory Whānau campaign brought out the vote. Shanti, you also looked a bit at the other results in Wellington, and were they similarly in that direction?
You have some of those councillors who have been there for absolute ages, like Nicola Young, Iona Panat, who are just back on council. Andy Foster's been on council for 30 years, so now he actually won't be for the first time. But Wellington has 7 new councillors, which is quite a decent number. Quite a few Labour and Green, as well as more, like Ray Chung in the northern suburbs, had a sort of mayoral campaign. It was vaguely associated with Andy Foster, but got in as a councillor.
Ray Chung, we should have paid more attention to. Formal apology to Ray Chung from all media. In that, on that, he was the last to be excluded. Before it came down to, so on that last count, he was third, and he was not invited to, as far as I'm aware, any of the debates.
Which makes the Paul Eagle result even more humiliating.
Yes. Although, like I say, Eagle beat him on the first preferences. But I guess it was, in the end, Andy Foster is not really right wing. He's not a cut, and he's been involved. He started off with the National Party, and then he ended up standing for New Zealand. He's been on a journey, Andy Foster. Very likable person, and it's funny. A lot of people I know who have been anti-Andy brigade for a while. That you talk to them in Wellington, they're like, actually, he's all right.
Bit more Andy Fandies than
bit more Andy Fandy than Andy. Exactly, well put. He managed not to get the Peter Jackson support. That's all. Go on, Jen.
I enjoyed that sort of salient thing where he said that he's really enjoyed his rat trapping and the thousands of rats that he's trapped. So if nothing else, the rat population of Wellington is
those salient.
Well, are they voters? That's the question, isn't it?
Those salient interviews kind of got some of the best answers out of the Wellington mayoral candidates.
Is it because there was alcohol involved? Cocktails with candidates, maybe.
Great student publication, Salient. You used to work at Salient, didn't you?
Yeah.
Also, just quickly on the Greater Wellington, on the Regional Council.
Yeah.
A bit of a green wave there.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Nash, who was a sitting Green councillor, is like, oh, no, it's no more progressive than before. But four Green candidates, I believe, got in. And yeah, there's just kind of a few of the incumbents were out, but kind of Greater Wellington Regional Council is so much with the Let's Get Wellington moving and all the kind of transport stuff that's happening. So having that strong Green voice will be interesting of how that plays out as they're kind of trying to put their transport policies through. A lot of the Wellington councillors are talking about transport. That's a big deal for them.
And other contests in Wellington, Stewart, you've got a bit of the Hut in your blood, don't you?
I do. Very proud Upper Hut, born and raised, where the Guppy train continued for another term. He's been the mayor for, I'm pretty sure, my entire life, if not longer. He won with a 14,000 vote majority again. In Hutt City, it was slightly closer, but Labour endorsed Campbell Barry, made it back.
Not just Labour endorsed, Labour on the Labour ticket.
Yeah. By about 2,000 votes, I think, over Tony Stellinger, who I think was a former chief executive of the council and was running on one of those tickets that we talked about. The pothole candidate, Falgun Patel, only got 1,100 or so votes. It was pretty much just running on a Fix the Pothole platform.
Yeah. And in Porirua, Anita Baker returned.
Yeah.
Comfortably. I don't think she had any real challenges, but an interesting one, if only because she's one of the main proponents of the Three Waters reforms. And contrary to the narrative that is broadly a real one, she was re-elected. And in Kapiti, Janet Holborough, replacing the Guru. The Guru, the K. Gurunatharan, who has been mayor maybe for 1 or 2 terms. Wanganui, moving a bit further north, we'll touch on this briefly because I think it's interesting. Hamish McDougall, who stood unelected, was re-elected last time unopposed. Hayden Donnell debated him and so that he could have some challenge. That was fun. But this time he got beaten, and I think that was a surprise to a lot of people, by somebody called Andrew Tripe, who stood very much on a Three Waters platform, anti-Three Waters, I should say. What about Ruapehu? That's kind of an interesting one, just worth touching on, Shanti.
Weston Curtin, who was the mayor for 2 terms in the 90s, and then has sort of floated around, was on Horizon's regional council in the previous term and has been elected again sort of 20 years later back as the mayor. But I called him up after he was quite busy in the afternoon. He had to celebrate a wedding first. So he was, officiating the wedding, and then I called him and he was having a nice barbecue with friends and family.
Found afterwards, which is a lovely story, although he's been thrown right into the fire because he's already been doing a million interviews because, of course, the situation with the skifield operators going into administration, keeping moving. Hamilton, a couple of good pieces by Amy Cronin on the spin-off with the 2 main candidates, Paula Southgate and Jeff Taylor. Paula Southgate was an incumbent win in a big city. I think it's the 4th biggest mayoralty. The constituency for a mayoralty. And so she's very much centrist. Jeff Taylor, former editor of the Waikato Times, was beaten, but not by heaps, by fewer than 2,000 votes. But it was still an incumbent win in a major centre is noteworthy. One of the things I think is interesting, and I got this from Amy's piece, is that Paula Southgate seems to have moved from being on a kind of working group of mayors to try and make Three Waters work, her position seems to have dialed a little bit, at least rhetorically, towards opposition to Three Waters, which perhaps tells you something about the mood more generally. And then we will dart up the expressway to Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, where it was a battle of attrition in a way. We started off, do you remember a man called Leo Malloy? I don't know if that rings a bell.
Yeah, that's right, way back in the mists of time.
Yeah, he was... He certainly was. Maybe he was a bit like, what do you call it? Like a fluffer who comes on. What do you call the person? A hype man who comes on at the start to kind of warm up the crowd,
and then stays on Twitter responding to Simon Wilson tweets.
Turns into a reply guy on Twitter. That's a bit of a shame. Come on, Leo, you're better than that. Anyway, Leo Malloy pulled out on the day nominations closed. Viv Beck, who'd been the endorsed candidate by the centre-right group CNR, also pulled out, but too late for her name to be removed from the ballots. And indeed, she ended up getting a few thousand votes.
7,000 votes or something.
Which left us with this two-horse race. Sorry, I was trying to find a way to avoid that cliche, but there it is. Between Efeso Collins, the Labour-endorsed, Green-endorsed councillor from South Auckland, and Wayne Brown, former Far North man, the self-styled fixer, and he won comfortably.
Yeah. Who do you think we can thank for that? Because there's been a lot of media reports saying this is because of Viv Beck dropping out. She was asked that a lot on Morning Report the other day. Leo Malloy, I believe, taking some of that credit as well, being that kind of, we don't want to split the vote. I don't know if based on the fact Viv still got 7,000 or 8,000 votes after pulling out, I don't know if it's quite so simple to say whether that race ended up being a result of the candidates.
Well, it was certainly not good for the Efeso Collins campaign to see those other people fall away. It was kind of this sort of Hunger Games version of STV, right? You know, it was just sort of people kind of were...
Because at one point, both Viv and Leo were, I guess, all up there as front. I mean, they were, I believe, when Wayne Brown joined the race, people sort of put him behind Leo and Viv in their pecking order, I feel.
Well, he had a lower profile generally. I mean, but the campaign was very old-fashioned in a way. It was target, I've said this before, but if you draw a Venn diagram of people who read the Herald in print version from Monday to Friday and people who vote in local elections in Auckland, it's a circle. You know, there is only the only place where it's better targeted audience than Facebook or Google.
And so, of course, that was where his thank you message on the day after the election was printed.
And I mean, and News Talk ZB ads, and also a very focused campaign. You know, it was they knew what they needed to do. And I guess, I mean, the Efeso Collins campaign, I don't think it was by any means a disaster. After the first big announcement of free public transport, there wasn't sort of another lift at any point. And it never really got you're waiting for the kind of ground game, the labour machinery, the what you referred to before in terms of the Chloe effect from Auckland Central. It never really came. And whether that's because the labour machine, the green machine aren't as well oiled, I don't know what. Maybe it's just the moment. That's the other thing. Well, sometimes you can't, sometimes swimming upstream is hard, and the mood of the electorate in Auckland and maybe the country is one of... Dalipa Fonseca wrote a really good piece and stuff the other day, which the first half of which was about sort of people's general feeling of dissatisfaction with the lack of progress. People are just feeling a bit shaking their fist at the sky, and Wayne Brown was shaking his fist at the sky.
And the closest we got to seeing that Labour Party machinery come out was a half-hearted Instagram post from the Prime Minister endorsing Efeso Collins.
Well, no, I mean, there was obviously the mailing list. The subscriber list is the real power, and the people were thinking, well, as we were talking about before, who could bring the vote out is the key thing, and that whatever was done there didn't work or didn't work as they would have hoped to. And depressingly, Shanti, as well, it's a real sad state of affairs that you look at some of the voter turnout in South Auckland and it's in the 20s, some in the lower 20s.
Yeah, I mean, surely the Collins campaign would have really hoped that those were the people who they really wanted to turn out for them, and a whole lot of the structural stuff, which I know we're going to get to, about local elections maybe doesn't advantage that kind of core voter base who might have been wanting to support Collins and his policies, but he also didn't have, Wayne Brown didn't, fixing, everyone likes the idea of fixing, but just that's kind of like, what are the kind of flashy policies that make people think, keep you front of mind when they're filling out their forms or opening them out and posting them away. Like, there's so many kind of things that go into that, which you kind of need to have that policy that really compels people to vote. And the harder it is for people to vote, the more you need the kind of big picture stuff that will compel people to... Yeah,
and we'll come on to that in a second. I'm just thinking as you're speaking about the idea of fixing is an interesting one, isn't it? Like it isn't necessarily, it doesn't mean improve, If I want my oven fixed, I don't want it to be a better, newer, fancier oven with more functions. I want the oven that I used to have. You know,
That's
there
what
is
a
a
lot
very
of the-
that was the mood.
Yeah, it was a lot of the campaign was looking at public transport and stuff. It was just, I want trains to run on time. I want buses to be able to get to places. I want roads that work. It wasn't, like you say, about making anything better, but just making things actually operate as they should.
You both went, Shanti, you were there at in the Sapphire Room.
Sapphire Room in Ponsonby
Central. I mean, a place you frequent often, I assume. I think it's a function room, isn't it?
Yeah. They hold real estate auctions there as well.
And then Stewart, you went to the first fleeting media appearance of Wayne Brown, who had cancelled broadcast interviews on the Sunday morning.
He denied that.
Someone on his team had agreed to them. Who knows? That's the whether or not he was personally. I'm not. Me talk to the media. Why would I want to do that?
Like
I'm the mayor now. I don't have to know this bullshit anymore.
And it felt a bit like he didn't know he was going to be talking to us when he turned up to work on Monday morning, because he walked into the council lobby, looked around, and sort of went, what are you lot doing here?
How did you know I was going to be here?
You've woken up early. Thanks for coming out.
Well, his team looked sheepish. What did you make of his first kind of appearance? I was struck, Shanti, about the extent to which I saw suddenly he was beaming for the first. I hadn't seen that before.
Oh, there was a bit of that kind of cat that got the cream kind of impression, I'd say. It was not actually a huge gathering. It wasn't kind of a party vibe at all, although I left sort of only after the first few sips of champagne. So
long before the banjo was pulled out to play at the road golf.
But yeah, it was sort of a few different media people there, and then a couple of his sort of team and supporters were just standing around him, and he was giving a speech and just looking very pleased with himself, and said, I've got a huge margin. And I asked him if he felt like, the low turnout gave him a mandate, and he said, I've got a bigger mandate than any government has ever had, which is a bit of a difficult statement to pass. But
it's not really true, is it? That's the issue. That's the only issue with it. Let's talk about the message nationwide. There's been, there's one reporter put it to Ardern that the government had got a hiding, and she sort of laughed sort of in a slightly longer way than felt like it was perfectly natural. And then Heather Duplessis-Allen said that Jacinda Ardern and the government had got a spanking, which is obviously they're really leaning into this
corporal punishment.
Corporal punishment.
I don't like the word spanking.
Metaphors. No, I'm not personally into spanking. Is that true? We talked about the local races being, but it is. The other thing is, I think Max Rashbrook called it a ratepayer revolt.
Yeah.
Is that what do you guys think? You've both been around the country, gone to more debates than is healthy. What is your impression in terms of that overall nationwide message, Shanti?
Some of those overall things, such as some of those like national policy statements that the councils need to adhere to, and especially Three Waters, those have been kind of routinely rejected by the vast majority of candidates. It's been, especially for Three Waters, some of the urban densification thing, it's sort of here and there, but it does seem like a lot of the local councils, it's sort of like what is within their power and what isn't. But that relationship of councils to government, they need the government funding. A lot of them have huge amounts of debt because of their water infrastructure, but they don't. The sort of whole framing of Three Waters has gone completely wrong. I think that Three Waters is such a kind of clear example of sort of dissatisfaction with kind of government orders coming from above.
It's become a catch-all, hasn't it? It's become a protest to which anything can be attached in a way.
I think it is slightly disingenuous for the Prime Minister to stand up and say that there is no link between the government's performance and the local elections. And I know she rolls out the examples of Len Brown being Auckland Mayor during John Key's tenure and that sort of thing. But I don't remember local elections in the past being as dominated by issues that are from central government to the same extent.
What she said, and this is classic reframing the question on the part of the politicians, is that I don't think there's a direct reflection from one to the other. And then she offered the examples of Banks being mayor when there was a Labour government, and Brown the First, Mayor Brown the First, being the mayor of Auckland when Key was the Prime Minister. But of course they have held meetings talking about what it means, particularly in terms of Three Waters. Of course they see the way the wind is blowing there. And in terms of the last, they do not want to go into, we've seen the emissions latest in terms of the agricultural sector this week. They will be highly aware of the risks of seeing what happened in 2017 happen on steroids in terms of the risk of it looking like an urban-rural divide. That risk of it looking like the government is just running roughshod over the wishes of councils. And the councils, when we look at, I stayed up far too late on Monday trying to work out looking at the different mayors' positions, and it was 43 of the 66 have expressed opposition to Three Waters. That's pretty compelling. And some of the opposition differs. Some of them are like, well, we've done very well. Why should we have to pay for other people's screw-ups? Some of them are very much, this is our stuff. They feel as though they have been, some of them occasionally, not as often as some might think, co-governance ripples into it. But the Three Waters message is a real one, and I wouldn't be surprised if in Select Committee there is some serious change to the structural approach.
And if your mayor is telling you that Three Waters is a terrible thing and a bad idea and they're taking our water away and we did such a good job of it, or, for whatever your reason for opposition to Three Waters is, and your mayor is saying this is a terrible thing, it's really might be hard if you're, in the kind of the famous undecided voters, like it'd be hard to trust the government to vote them back in. If you're like, well, that's coming from my mayor says it's bad, they know my local area. Why would I vote in the government that is doing something that's bad to my local area? And especially if you're supporter of that mayor and supporter of that council.
I guess what they'll hope to do is, and we'll be talking about this in the months to come, the other option will be, listen, we just got to push this through, and once it's in the rearview mirror, rather than then it's done, and it's not going to be, whether or not it's top of the list for being repealed if the government changes or not, who knows? But the best way to make it not an election issue is not to drag it out. Will be the other way of looking at it.
Because we've seen the Prime Minister, even though there hasn't been a softening of the policy itself, it feels like the Prime Minister has softened her level of defence on it to some extent, I guess, even during that press conference where she laughed about the national wave or whatever. She was pretty happy to admit that issues like Three Waters were contentious and that there was going to be ongoing debate on that. But I don't remember her necessarily calling it Three Waters, talking about it. She was very much just like, these are infrastructure improvements that need to be made. No mayors were running on a policy of hiking rates. It feels like the argument has changed slightly.
Yeah, maybe the problem was calling it Three Waters. They should have called it something much more...
Big pipes or... something
abstruse and incomprehensible. Hey, let's talk quickly about turnout. Other people have talked about turnout. We've been sort of banging on about turnout since the start of the thing. Looking like it'll probably hit over 40% across the country. It's 42%, I think, across the country last time. Short, sharp review is the call from the LGNZ, the Local Government Association, Shanti. But we've already had a bunch of reviews saying that turnout isn't good enough on what to do. What would you do if you could wave a magic wand and fix it?
Your piece on Monday on the spinoff.co.nz was very good, looking at some of the issues. But I think one other aspect that I was thinking about is just the sort of amount of internal conflict and the amount that councils feel like councils are fighting with each other. They're bickering. They're focused on themselves.
Looking inwards.
Yeah, and that doesn't appeal to anyone. That doesn't make voters feel like they're at all connected. And lots of it is just communication. Lots of people don't have a clear idea, including many candidates don't have a clear idea of what a council does and doesn't do.
Yes.
So, if the council and the candidates aren't communicating that clearly to voters, why would anyone want to vote? And if everyone trusts that the services are provided,
it's just confusing. And I mean, there have been a couple of suggestions towards the end that actually maybe it suggests a level of satisfaction if people don't want to vote, which I think is a bit of a strain. And even if there is some truth in it, there's obviously a legitimacy issue if you have turnout so low. But Stewart, my view on it, which I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, is that even if there's no silver bullet, the silver bullet is make people really engaged and have people understanding all those sorts of things, but there are still a bunch of little things that could probably be done to nudge it up towards at least 50%.
Well, you would never see a general election voting day on the same day as an All Blacks test, and yet the local elections polling day was on the same day as the opening of the Women's Rugby World Cup. I don't know if there's any connection between the low turnout and the vast numbers pouring into Eden Park, but
I can answer that there's not.
Okay.
Yeah. but I hear what you're saying, that if there was more attention paid, and, polls close at noon, of course, on election day. But it is an interesting argument that if we were to have an election day, which isn't necessarily so much about the day, but about the build-up to the day, with advance voting, those lovely orange signs outside libraries
stickers,
and post offices. The post offices still exist.
Social media call-outs, queues down the street.
Oh, dogs.
Dogs at polling booths.
Dogs at polling, maybe there weren't enough dogs involved in the coverage of local elections. That's it. We've nailed it.
Yeah.
There are various other... Shanti mentioned it. I spoke to a guy called Andy Asquith who's smart on this stuff and had 10 sort of things that could be done. You can read that also on our website. Hey, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Very, very cool to work with you both on local elections coverage. A lot of fun, and there's still more to come. Ka kite anō.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at the Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.